Blackwood Boys Novella 4, Part 3 and Oshanasar, Life in the Sprawl, the Pits. Late fall, sir, the second month. The dog pits stood in the gap country west of the city, in the waste ground where the sprawl petered out and the penny markets began. The city wall stood off at a distance as though holding its nose, and the hills began. A great sunken ring of timber and stone that had been a cattle market once, and a slave market before that, if the old men were to be believed. Around it had grown a shanty town of sheds and kennels and wagon yards, fenced in scrap, torchlit on fight nights, and drained by gutters that ran dark twice a week. The man who ran the pits was called Red-Eye, for the burst blood in his left eye that had never healed and never faded, so that he seemed always to be looking at the world through a wound. He had held the pits 11 years, which in that country was a dynasty, and he had held them the way such things were held, by knowing the worth of everything that bled. And Red-Eye knew, as every pitman from the sea to the Hackett Mountains knew, what a Blackdown Mastiff was worth. Dogs brought long ago from the far north for boar and wolf, and worse, bred 200 years by the hard people of Blackdown, who culled sentiment along with weakness. A handful had come south to Bannock over the generations, and everyone had made its owner rich before it died. Then Blackdown had burned, and the pitmen had toasted the lines passing the way merchants toast a drowned cargo, with real grief of the purse. So when word came down out of the western hills of a northern boy with 6 dogs, and among them a grey brindle bitch, a hand taller than anything in the southern pits, Red-Eye paid his informants well, and sent the polite man. The polite man came 3 times. The first time he came with a bag of gold and fine manners, and set the bag on the stoop, and Damien looked at more money than he had ever seen and said, "She's not mine to sell, she's hers. Tell your employer no." The second time he came with a bigger bag and a paper promising beef, and warm kennels and breeding to the best. And Damien didn't come to the gate at all, but sent word by George that the answer hadn't changed, and wasn't going to. The third time he came with nothing in his hands, and stood a respectful distance off, and said, "My employer respects a man who can't be bought, truly. He's asked me to say the matter is closed." And he tipped his hat and went. And Bones, who was home that day and watched the whole exchange from the doorway with his flask, said quietly, "That's the visit that worries me. Men like that don't come all this way to say goodbye." But the weeks went on, and no fourth visit came, and worry, like every other stray in the sprawl, wanders off if you stop feeding it. Then, on a cold, bright morning, a letter came. Not to the door, to Damien himself, pressed into his hand in the market by a kennel lad with straw on his boots, who was gone before there were questions. Damien waited till Ewan was home for it to be read. The letter was ill-spelled and honest-looking, and it said this, that the writer worked the wagon yards out by the pits, that a dog trader down from the border country had come through the yards a month past and gone bust, and that among the stock seized for his debts was a young male mastiff, grey brindle, 3 feet at the shoulder, silent as a post, with a cropped Blackdown earmark, and that the writer, having heard tell of a northern boy with a Blackdown bitch, thought the boy might want to come and look at the animal before it was sold south or thrown to the pits to be ruined. "Come quiet," the letter said. "Come alone, and bring the bitch so the beasts could be matched by eye, but no other dogs, for the male was kennel-shy and half-mad from the wagons already." Now Damien was still green, but no fool. He would be 15 this year. Ewan read Damien his letter 4 times. Damien knew what it might be. And he went anyway, and if you want to understand why, you must understand what that earmark meant to him. It meant that Blackdown was not entirely ash. It meant the line, his grandfather's line, 200 years of it, might live. Against that, the odds of a trap weighed like a feather against an anvil, and he knew the weighing was wrong even as he made it. And he made it anyway, because some hooks are baited not with what a boy wants, but with what he grieves. After reassuring Ewan that he would go, he told Ego that he would take Bitch to the western hills to run her. He left the rest of the dogs in the courtyard, howling betrayal at the gate. And he walked out through the gap country to the wagon yards by the pits, with the great grey brindle bitch at his side, following a straw-booted lad through a maze of sheds and fences. And the gate of the last yard closed behind them, and there was no mail, and there never had been, and there were 11 men with nets and wire nooses and padded leathers to the elbow, because Red-Eye had, for once in his life, over-prepared rather than under. Even so, it cost them. The bitch put 2 men on the ground before the doubled. Weighted nets came down on her from 3 sides, and Damien fought with the knife and then with his hands and then with his teeth. And it took a pole behind his knees and a boot behind that to finish it. They put the 2 of them in a brick shed in the rear yards with a barred door together, because the handlers had already discovered in the first hour that the bitch would let no man near her, nor eat, nor drink, nor so much as be looked at without the boy in her sight. And Red Eye, hearing this, felt the first cold finger of a thought he did not like, that he had bought a treasure with no keyhole, and the only key in the world was a boy who spat blood at him through the bars. Word came to the alley by supper, and it came the way most true things came to that house. Through George. George's network was 3 months old and already a living thing. A dozen runners, potboys, wagon lads, and market urchins who traded him word for coppers and favours. And one of them, a kennel boy from the wagon yards who owed George for a matter involving a magistrate's runner and a conveniently wrong direction, slipped up the alley at dusk and told him plain, "Northern boy in the rear sheds, big grey dog with him, took this morning. Red Eye's own lads did it. And there's a fight night tonight, so the yards'll be crawling." Ego was not home. Ego was at the brickyards on a night shift he could not walk out of without losing the wage that fed them all, and would not be back before the small hours, and this fact should be remembered kindly when what follows is judged, because the 2 who went were 14 and 12, and they went because waiting felt like a kind of murder. They went together as far as the torchlight, and then they went apart, because they were different animals, and they knew it. George went sideways into the dark to walk the fence line, as was his nature. And Ewan, gentle Ewan who cursed himself for even reading that letter to Damien, Ewan who stitched wounds, picked herbs, ran errands, and had never in his life won a fight or fought one alone. Ewan paid his copper at the crowd gate and walked in the front, on the theory that a crowd is a hiding place, which is true right up until you have to leave it. The pits on a fight night were a roaring, torchlit, reeking bowl, tears packed to swaying, oddsmen howling, the air above the sand shimmering with heat and breath. Ewan pushed through it with his heart in his throat, and it was there, wedged in the crush by the rail, that he saw a thing that made no sense. Bones. Bones in the pit crowd, flask in hand, swaying, red-faced, bawling something at the oddsmen. Drunk, or every appearance of it. Drunk in the crowd, while Damien sat in a shed 100 yards off. Ewan felt something curdle in his chest that he didn't have a name for yet, and he had no time for it. And he turned his back on the old man and went looking for the sheds. He asked a potboy, who shrugged. He asked a wagon lad, who took his copper and pointed him down a dark run between kennels toward the rear yards, and Ewan went down it, and the run bent twice, and at the second bend there was a man in front of him, and when he turned, a man behind. And the wagon lad's copper had already been spent twice that night, once by each side. What followed was not the kind of fight the songs are made of. It needs telling honestly, Ewan fought like what he was, a Blackwood, a charcoal boy, and now a physician's apprentice with no hunger for hurting, all elbows and panic, grabbing where he should have struck and striking where he should have run. He took a fist to the ear that filled the world with bells. He bit a hand. He was shoved into a fence and shoved off it, and somewhere in the scramble his flailing arm found a hanging bucket and swung it, and the bucket met the front man's head with a sound like a dropped pot, and the man sat down in the mud. Looking surprised, and Ewan ran. He ran the wrong way. That must be said too. There was no way to the road that wasn't through the second man, so he ran the only way open, through a gap in the wagons and out the back of the pit sprawl of sheds and spotty fencing. West, away from the city, away from home, into the gap country and the dark hills beyond, with a shout and then footsteps behind him for the first half-mile, and then only his own breath. And he kept running long after the footsteps stopped, because his body had stopped asking his mind for instructions. He ran until his legs went, on a hillside he didn't know, under a cold sailing moon. And then he did the one wise thing left in him. He found a nook among a stand of old stunted wind-bent trees, a dry hollow floored with decades of needles, sheltered from the wind and hidden from the slope. And he crawled into it and shook for a while and slept the sleep of the emptied. George, meanwhile, had found what George always found, the gap in the world's attention, a stretch of scrap timber fencing behind the wagon yards, mended so many times that its final mending had been an act of pure hope, gave to his hands like an old acquaintance, and he was inside and became what he was better at being than anyone alive. Nobody in particular, going nowhere special, at exactly the pace of a boy sent on an errand. He too saw Bones. He saw him from the mouth of the kennel rose across the torchlit crush, the old man weaving, flask high, roaring at the odds board, and George, who did not feel things often but felt them hard, stood for a moment in the dark and was furious, with a flat, cold 13-year-old fury. Tonight, of all the nights in the world, tonight. Then he filed it, the way he filed everything, and moved on. He found the shed inside the half hour. Rear yards, brick, barred door, one of Red-Eye's men on a stool in front of it, and through the gap under the door a sliver of lamplight. And in the lamplight a shadow that paced 3 steps, turned, paced 3 steps, turned. The exact caged rhythm of an angry Blackwood. And beside the pacing, low down, a stillness that was somehow more alarming than any motion. The bitch, lying against the door itself, watching the light under it. George did not open that door. This is what made George George. He stood in the dark and did the arithmetic without sentiment. One guard he could trick away, yes, but past the guard were the yards, and past the yards the fences, and between here and there 100 men on a fight night, and a boy who could barely walk by the sound of him, and a dog that no rope in the city would hold, and no Ewan anywhere. He had looked, he had listened at the crowd's edges, and Ewan had gone into this place, and had not come out of it, and was not in it, and that was a problem with too many shapes to solve in the dark. He needed leverage, he needed weight. Weight in the Blackwood family had a name. George went back through the fence and sprinted, and George, who never sprinted unless it was needed, ran the whole gap country and half the sprawl, and hauled Ego off the brickyard floor mid-shift with 6 words. And Ego did not ask a single question until they were already moving, which was Ego's own particular genius. At the house he went down to the cellar and came up with the thing wrapped in oilcloth. They had found it in their first week, bricked behind a false course in the cellar wall with a soldier's kit long gone to rot. One more question the house declined to answer. A war crossbow, not a poacher's toy, but a military machine. Black steel and old dense wood. A goat's foot lever to span it. A dozen bolts headed for punching through boiled leather and the men inside it. Ego had cleaned and oiled it weeks ago and said nothing, and the family had watched him do it and said nothing either, because some tools you keep the way you keep a prayer, hoping never to need it, meaning it all the same. He spanned it once in the kitchen to test the string. The sound it made was final, like a door. They did not sneak. That was the whole of the plan, and it was Ego's, and it was correct. Sneaking is what you do when you are weak, and the one thing they could not afford tonight was to be weak. They walked up the wagon road to the main gates of the pit yards in the grey hour before dawn, when the fight crowd had drained away and the torches were burning down and Red-Eye's men were counting a fortune in loose coin. And Ego Blackwood stood in the open, axe in hand, 16 years old and built like a retaining wall, and hammered the gate with his fist and said in a voice pitched to carry across every yard behind it, "Red-Eye, you've got my brother and our dog. Bring them out, or there's trouble." There was laughter first, of course. Then the gate opened, because pit men do not hide behind gates from single boys, and they came out to deal with him. 4, then 7, then 10, picking up bill poles and iron as they came, spreading into the loose crescent that working men form when they mean to make a lesson of someone. And then the crescent stopped spreading, because from the top of a parked hay wagon off the road's edge, a small flat voice said, "That's close enough." And they turned and saw a boy of 12 sitting cross-legged with a spanned war crossbow, steadied on his knee. The bolt's head wandering with perfect calm from face to face, and the boy's expression suggesting nothing so much as a clerk, waiting for a slow customer to decide. It is a strange truth of armed men that 10 of them will charge a giant and balk at a child. And the reason is arithmetic. The giant can only break the first 2. But nobody in a crescent of 10 knows which one of them the bolt is for, and a war bolt at 40 feet does not wound. Red-Eye came out himself then, wounded eye and all, and the war of words that followed was long and profane and conducted across 30 feet of frozen mud, and it went, boiled down, Like this, Red-Eye said the dog was seized fair against trespass and damages, 2 of his men being laid up bleeding, and the boy held for the same, and that the watch. Igo said the watch didn't come west of the wall, and both of them knew it, and that as for damages, Red-Eye had baited a child out of his home with a forged letter, and if he wanted to talk fair, they could talk about it all winter, 1 visit at a time. Red-Eye said big words for a brickyard boy, and that he had 30 men inside. Ego said he was sure that was true, and asked conversationally how many of them slept in the same place every night, and whether Red-Eye did, and mentioned that his family had 4 Blackwood dogs guarding their home, and let the silence do the rest. But here is the thing that truly ended it, and Red-Eye was fool enough about many things, but never about the worth of what bled. The bitch was useless to him. He'd have needed to starve her biddable, and he'd seen in one night that 4 years wouldn't do it. She would not eat, would not fight, would not be owned. And the boy who was her only keyhole came from a family that was standing at his gate at dawn with a war crossbow that should be mounting a castle wall, and would keep coming, and there is no prophet in the world that survives a feud with people who have nothing to lose. He was holding a treasure that was only treasure in somebody else's hands, and the somebody was looking at him through a steel sight. "Bring them out," Red-Eye said at last, disgusted, to no one in particular, and then to Ego, with his wounded eye catching the torchlight. "Hear me, boy. This is the whole of the mercy. If I see that dog, that brother, or any of your cursed family inside my fences again, if you're so much as smelled near my pits, you'll go in the crates with the culls, and what comes out won't need burying. Now get off my road." They brought Damien out limping, one eye closed, rope burned to the wrists, and grinning through a split lip in a way that made Ego want to hit him personally. The bitch came out beside him unheld, because no rope was offered and none would have been suffered, and she walked past the crescent of armed men slowly, looking at each of them as she went, unhurried, thorough, filing them away, and more than one hard man found something to study on the ground until she had passed. They went home up the wagon road in the grey dawn, 3 brothers and a dog, and it should have been the finest walk of their lives, and instead it was a walk full of holes. Where's Ewan was one hole, and George's flat retelling. Went in the front, never came out, not held inside, not found outside, made it deeper with every step. And Bones was the other, because George told that too, in 2 dry sentences, and Damien said, he what? And the anger in the alley kitchen that morning had 2 targets and nowhere to put either of them. They did not go looking for Ewan in the hills, and here is the honest reason, which the family would argue about for years. George said, and George was right by every rule of George's world, that Ewan was neither captive nor corpse at the pits, that Ewan knew the western hills from a dozen herb walks, that a boy loose and running goes home, and that the worst thing a hunted family could do the morning after armed threats was scatter itself across open country in daylight within sight of Red-Eye's fences. It was correct, every word of it was correct and cold, and they were all half dead on their feet besides. And they posted Sage at the gate and slept in shifts and told themselves he'd walk in by noon. Ewan walked in at dusk the next day, having woken frozen at mid-morning in his nook among the stunted trees with a hero's aches, and no idea for a long moment where or who he was, and having then walked the long, wary loop around the pit country that fear plots for you, and he came through the gate sheepish and furious in equal measure, and the 2 feelings took turns all evening. Sheepish because, as Damien did not fail to observe from behind his spectacular black eye, Ewan had gone to a rescue and been rescued from it by a bucket, and had then conducted a strategic withdrawal away from the city he lived in, and had spent the night sleeping in a shrub while his brothers faced down 30 men. And furious, truly, deeply furious, in a way that surprised everyone including him, because nobody had come. He stood in the kitchen with his ear still ringing and pine needles still in his collar and said, "I was on a hillside all night, alone. And you all just slept?" And George explained the arithmetic, correct and cold, every word of it right. And Ewan looked at his little brother for a long moment and said, "One day, George, you're going to be right like that about the wrong person," and went up the stairs. And that particular sentence stayed in the house for years, the way some sentences do, waiting. They mended it, the way that family mended things, badly, sideways, and completely. Damien took the blame he'd earned and took it in full, which cost him, because it had been his want and his weighing that opened the whole door. He grew up that night, everyone could see it. Ego instituted the first true Blackwood law that was written down, on the kitchen wall, in charcoal, in Ewan's careful hand, because Ewan had the best letters. Nobody goes alone, nobody gets left. Both halves of it, side by side, each brother reading his own conviction in it, which is what a good law is. But Bones did not come home to see the law written. Bones did not come home at all. The story of what had happened to Bones came to them in pieces, over days, with each Blackwood hearing different parts, and it never got less strange for retelling. The old man had not been drunk at the pits by accident, and, this took longest to swallow, he may not have been entirely drunk at all. He had known within hours of Damien's taking. Weck had seen the boy led off the market road and had come muttering to the alley and found only Bones home, and the old man had put on his worst coat and gone out to the pits himself, alone, on legs that hadn't been of use in a fight for 20 years, to do the only thing he was still armed for, to be a harmless, familiar, invisible old drunk in a fight crowd, and to talk. He had been working the oddsmen and the handlers all that evening, buying rounds, bawling and swaying, and asking, between the bawling, soft little questions about the new dog and the northern boy, and which shed and whose key, an old man laying the ground, in his own crooked way, for a rescue. That much they got from a potboy in George's network, who'd been paid by Bones for gin twice that night, and remembered him kindly. The rest came from a wagon lad who'd seen the end of it, and had brother his sister to see Ewan when she had a fever she could not break. The boy told it like was story he had heard rather than see. Late that night, near the crowd gate, men had come through the crush, 4 of them, in dark livery that nobody at the pits knew, and nobody at the pits liked the look of, and they had closed on the old drunk quietly, from the sides, the way men do who have done such work before. There had been a scuffle, brief and nearly silent. The wagon lad said the old man actually fought, flask flying, all elbows, and landed one good blow that would have made Ewan feel much better about buckets had he known. And then he was simply gone, carried more than walked, out to the wagon road where a carriage stood, lacquered, lamps at its corners. The lad had watched it roll away east, toward the city, toward the bronze gates, and the gates had opened. At night. They opened the gates at night for it. Ewan asked, of course. Ewan asked everyone. Fiver, who knew everything, went unusually still when George described the livery, and said only, "Leave it, boy," and would not be paid, drawn, or provoked into another word on it, which from Fiver was more frightening than any answer. And here, since the boys will not learn it for a long while yet, the story may as well tell you the truth of it plainly, for the little it explains and the much it promises. The men in dark livery were not enemies of the old man, or not exactly. They were servants of a great house in the high rings near the citadel, and they had been looking for him on and off for the better part of 30 years, and the word that finally found him had come, as words do, from the pits, where too many people that week had been talking about the northern boy, the great black bitch, and the strange old surgeon of the sprawl who kept their company. The order for the carriage had been given by 2 very old women in a house with 100 windows, his sisters. What Bones was to them, what he had been before he was Bones, and why a man would spend 30 years hiding from his own blood in the worst quarter of the city, drinking himself invisible, that is a story with its own chunk, and it will keep. What matters tonight is this. He was carried back up to the rings like a debt being collected, sitting straight as a rod between his captors, looking at nothing, and the rooms over the alley kitchen went silent. Ewan didn't touch those rooms for 9 days. On the 10th he went up and cleaned the instruments the way he'd been taught and laid them back in their fierce defended order, and sat down in the old man's chair with his anatomy book and the great stack that Bones had carried with him everywhere. And that was the beginning of something too. "He's not dead," Damien said one night, fierce, to no one who'd argued otherwise. "No," George agreed from the window in his flat slate voice. And then, because George never could help being George, "He's not dead, I'd know." Nobody asked him how, nobody ever asked George how. But since this is the story's own page and not the kitchen, it can be said here what could not be said there. George would have known, because George could see them. There were 2 graves in the courtyard. He had found them in the first week, 2 low humps along the north wall under the elder bush, old past guessing, their marker stones worn to blank thumbs of rock. And he had stood over them a long moment and then said nothing to anyone, because George's first instinct with any true thing was to put it in his pocket. And on certain nights, cold ones mostly, when the house was asleep, there were 2 figures in the courtyard. They did not walk so much as drift, the way smoke moves in a still room. They had the shapes of people the way a water stain has the shape of a face. They never spoke. He had tried, once, in the small hours, flatly, well, and they had only turned toward him, both together, the way weather vanes turn, and gone on with their slow circuit of the walls. Mostly they were no trouble, but things happened in that house. The gate latch lifted itself on windless nights. Fires guttered and stood back up. Things put down in one place were found in another, always small things, always moved, never taken, as though someone were forever tidying to a plan no living person could see. The dogs knew. The dogs had always known. They would lift their heads all 5 together and watch an empty corner with mild professional interest, and put their heads back down, having apparently decided long ago that whatever it was household. Once, only once that first winter, a full basin of wash water went over in an empty room with a crash. On the very night Ewan lay fevered from his soaked hillside sleep, and when George reached the room, the 2 figures were at the window, both together, looking out at the alley as though at something coming. And there was nothing in the alley at all. He told no one. He watched and filed it and kept his own counsel, 13 years old, the family's keeper of one more locked drawer. If the dead of that house were guarding something, or waiting for something, or warning of something, they declined to say, and George, who understood better than anyone alive the value of information withheld, could respect that in a ghost. Winter came in hard the following week, the first snow hissing on the roofs, and it was the cold that finally sent them up to the 3rd floor. Heat rises, and the 2nd floor was losing all of theirs into whatever lay above. The door at the top of the stairs was not locked but stuck, swollen through some old warping, and Ego went up with a pry bar and his shoulder, and it gave with a crack like river ice. Cold air breathed down over them, and dust and rot and 40 years. Whoever had sealed those rooms had meant to come back. That much could still be read in the bones of the place. Sheets over furniture, shutters fastened from within. But the roof had betrayed the trust. Somewhere up in the slates, a wound had been letting in weather for decades. And the 3rd floor was a drowned kingdom. Plaster down in grey drifts, boards spongy and black along the north side, the sheeted furniture underneath gone to soft ruin, everything furred and swollen and smelling of the grave of paper. Even so, 2 things up there stopped them where they stood, and both had to be dug for. The first was in the roof gable on the alley side, reached by a ladder stair with 3 rungs rotted through, the wreck of a pigeon coop. Not a poor man's coop of scrap and hope, you could still see that in the corner joints, but joiner built once, fine work, nesting shelves and a landing board opening through the gable to the sky. Now it was a collapse of green-black timber and 40 years of weather, plundered by rats and roosted in by every wild thing with wings. They sifted it for the better part of 2 days because George insisted on his knees in the filth with a lamp. What the wreck gave up was this: 5 tiny brass capsules of the kind that clip to a bird's leg, corroded shut, 2 of them crushed, and jammed beneath the fallen shelf, wrapped in perished oilskin, the corpse of a ledger, swollen to a brick, its pages fused to pulp, mold gone through it like rot through an apple. Ewan worked on it by the fire for a week with a thin blade and the patience of a surgeon, parting leaves that came away in crumbs, and out of the whole drowned book he salvaged perhaps a dozen readable fragments, columns of dates, decades old, and beside them strings of cipher in a hand that was small and fine and utterly unhurried. And one only, half-line in plain words, where the cipherer had perhaps been tired, or perhaps past caring. No reply again this month, I will keep sending. Years of messages out, and at least at the end, nothing coming back. The second thing was the room below the coop, and it was worse and better at once. It had been a map room that they pieced together slowly, for the water had come down its north wall in sheets and taken most of the papering with it, layered maps sliding off the plaster into a mulch on the floor like leaves off a dead tree. What survived clung to the drier south and east walls in islands and rags. A beautiful sliver of harbour with its soundings, a hand's breadth of coast road, parts of the city's inner rings in survey work so fine that George stood in front of one surviving corner with his lips parted like a boy at a shrine. They spent evenings up there all through the early winter with lamps and soft brushes, peeling the fallen mulch apart layer by layer on the floorboards, drying fragments between cloths, hunting scraps the way Ewan hunted herbs. 2 scraps out of all of it earned their place in this story. Damien found the first, in the mulch, on the 4th evening. A ragged, palm-sized piece of some great map of the whole country and beyond, water-stained to sepia, most of its names bled to shadows. But in its top corner, in the far cold north of the fragment, one dot with one name still legible, and Damien went suddenly still and said, in a voice that had to try twice, "There's Blackdown, the Hackett Hills." A dot. A tiny dot with a tiny name, surviving 40 years of rain in a sealed room, in a house full of graves. They dried it, and Ewan pasted it to a board, and it went on the kitchen wall beside the charcoal law, and nobody ever said why, and nobody ever had to. George found the second, because it was George who noticed absences. On the east wall, one island of the Great City Survey had survived almost whole, a stretch of the southeastern quarters annotated all over in that same small, fine, unhurried hand, rents and wells and marks whose meanings had died with their maker, every street dense with notes, every street but those of one district. Where the spice market stood, the surviving fragment simply went blank. Not damaged, not water-eaten, for the paper there was sound. Undrawn, nothing entered at all, just a single circle of faded ink around the emptiness, drawn firm and sure, the way a man circles something he does not need to label because he, at least, knows exactly what it is. George stood in front of that circle until full dark, while below him the family's voices rose warm through the floorboards, arguing about supper, and the 2 silent figures in the courtyard drifted their slow rounds under the falling snow. Then he breathed on the cold glass of the window and looked out at the ruined gable where the landing board still opened on the winter sky, and had a thought he did not share with anyone in his flat slate certain way: that pigeon coop won't stay empty.